So stories define all of us, and the same is true for children with SEND. And today we'll explore the powerful narratives about these children and learn how to recognise these stories, understand their impact, and discover how they can help or hinder the children that we aim to support. So a little about Jo. She's an international sensory engagement and inclusion specialist, trainer, author, TEDx speaker, and founder of the Fantastic Sensory Projects. She's consistently been rated as outstanding by Ofsted, and she's taught in both mainstream and special school settings, and she connects with pupils of all ages and abilities. Joanna draws on her own experience from private and professional life, as well as taking in all the information she can from the archives. And Joanna's private life includes family members with disabilities and neurodiverse conditions, and she spent time as a registered foster carer for children with profound disabilities. She's published quite a few books, too many to mention here, but we will link them in the email that comes after the event. And she's a huge fan of social media and is always happy to connect. So over to you, Jo.
Hello, everybody. It's lovely to be back. It's also very odd to listen to that introduction. You think, gosh, I am really old. That's what the introduction tells you. It's like, I've been doing this for a long time. All of those things that Gail just said, I didn't do them all at once. They've been very much sequential through life. And it's lovely to be back. Normally when I talk to Parenta, I just chat to you and we don't have any slides up, but I got really organised today and I've made us some slides. So I think people will nod at me. Adele and Gail will nod at me if my slides are showing on. Yes, that's good. Yes. If my slides are showing on your screen. If you are able to have your cameras on and Gail's let you have your cameras on, it's lovely to see a few faces just so that I know whether I'm boring you or not making sense or things like that. And if you are one of the few faces and you're bored, really amp it up so that I know, because you're just on little like thumbnails on my screen. So yeah, don't worry if you can't have your cameras on, but it's lovely to see your faces if you can. And I know that a lot of people are going to be watching this webinar later, and so they'll watch the recording because they'll be at work now or they haven't been able to sneak out. So hello to those people as well as hello to you. The benefit for you guys is that you will be the people who get to ask questions. If you're one of the people watching the recording, you are welcome to send me questions online. My social media links are on the screen. You're always welcome to pop a message to me. We're talking about the stories that we tell about children with special educational needs and disabilities. And we all know already that the stories that get told about us make a difference to who we are and who we become. You were probably like the good child at home or the naughty one or the mischievous one. I remember when I trained, yes, you will get the slides after the session, by the way, to the person who's just asked that. I'm trying not to read the chat because I'll get distracted, but that was an easy one to answer. When I trained to be a primary school teacher, they did the very foolish thing of designating the 4 classes in my year group by Harry Potter houses. So there was a Gryffindor class, a Hufflepuff class, and I was in Slytherin and I hadn't read Harry Potter, but every time we walked into the room as Slytherin class, the lecturers would go, "Oh, it's Slytherin." And I have never been so badly behaved in an education setting as I was training to be a teacher. And it was purely because you got that vibe off the lecturers as you walked in there and, "Oh, Slytherins." So I'd sit at the back and mess around and do things like that. And those stories that are created around us affect how we behave and affect who we become. When I was little, I lived on a concrete boat at sea, which accounts for some of the weirdness, but not all of it. And I've heard lots of stories about who I was when I lived on the boat. There's a story that my parents often tell me about how I had a magic winch and I could winch this magic winch and take out anything from inside it. And if I saw things like a container ship on the horizon or a dolphin in the bow wave, I could collect them and put them into my magic winch to play with later. And that's a story that I've been told by my family, by friends who came out to visit us on the boat, by my grandparents. It frames me as a resourceful individual who can create play from next to nothing. And those of you who watch the sensory projects unfold online witness the adult that grew from that story. There are other stories that I could have been told about living on the boat that I haven't been told. I found I was helping my mum clear her roof a few years ago, and we found a box of letters that she'd written to her mum when she was on the boat. And she was on the boat with 2 small children. There was a time when she was living on board, and we would have been like 0 and 2.5, 0 and 2. So she's got 2 tiny children. She's living on a boat at a time before mobile phones. She's out in the middle of the sea. My dad's sailing. And there's all these horrific stories that she tells her mum about how she thought we were going to drown. The storm was so bad. They thought we were going to sink. And it's terrifying, absolutely terrifying stuff. And then amongst them are lots of stories about how seasick she used to get. So it's really silly that she used to live on a boat, because she gets horribly seasick. So there's these accounts of her when she's been ill for days, and she's lying on the floor of the boat holding my baby sister in her arms because she's a baby, and she's so like sick she can't get up. She's too dizzy and weak. I am the 2-year-old who trod on her stomach. I'm the 2-year-old who kicked her in the head. I'm the person who hurt her when she was at her most vulnerable, and I've never been told that story. You know, who would the adult be if that's the story I'd grown up hearing? And the stories we tell about children when they are very young are so important. They last through a lifetime. And I wanted to pick up today on some of the stories that I hear, particularly in relation to children with special educational needs and disabilities, but not always. You know, sometimes these are told for, you know, for other children as well. Let's see. Here we go. Trying to turn my slides over. There we go. Oh, we've done the introduction to me. These are the stories that I'm aiming to tell. So there's one that's what I call the bad seed story. There's another that it's bad behaviour, and there's another is bad parenting. These are really, really common tropes, and I encounter these stories in all sorts. Like when I go into settings, somebody will tell me these stories. I witness them. I don't know if any of you are members of Facebook groups to look at early years provision, but they're awash with these stories. And then there's a couple of others that I'm not going to talk about today, but they're stories that you know. One of them is, oh, they've got insert name of condition here, you know, insert name of disability here, so they can't, you know, they've got X, so they can't. I don't think that's a story that any of you will be telling. I have encountered it in settings. I've encountered it in like, oh, they've got X, so they can't go outside. Like, or they've got X, so they don't go out if it's raining, or they've got X, so they don't want to, you know, have friends or play games or whatever it is. But I don't expect you're telling that story. Or they've got X, therefore they're a superhero. They're inspirational. They're so brave. And you might be telling that story. It's a slightly kinder story to be telling. It's still a really dodgy one. Like I've got a friend who has just one leg, and she is really fed up of being stopped on the street by people telling her she's an inspiration. She's like, I've just got one leg. I'm not an inspiration. I'm not a particularly good human. I'm not especially brave. I've just got one leg. Like it wasn't nice when they chopped the other one off. But it's a lot of pressure if people are constantly kind of looking at you going, oh, you're so amazing. Oh, you're so lovely. Oh, you're a superhero. Like, okay, enough. Like, kind of story, but not one you want to be telling. These stories, thinking about them in the early years is so powerful, because these stories begin with you. And often when families are creating these stories, they tell them to you. So you are a place that can change the course of these stories. And I've got my train tracks online because that analogy is perfect here. A tiny change in these stories now has such a big consequence later in life. And so it can seem really fussy. It can seem like you're being like the language police, or you're being especially correct, or all of those things. But those little tweaks now makes such a huge difference down the line. It's very little difference now, but it's so important. So you're where these stories begin. You can change these stories as they start to form, as they start to build around children. You can challenge them, and the consequences down the line are huge. Spotting these stories, that's why I'm doing you 3 kind of big, bold type stories now, can be really key in making that little adjustment. And those little adjustments can be life changing. They can also be life lengthening in a very, you know, serious way. So my first story was that some children are just born evil. And Gail told you a lot about me in her introduction. One of the jobs that I've had, I used to be an inspector for schools, not part of Ofsted because I don't look serious enough, but part of one of those teams that takes over failing schools and zhuzhes them up a bit. I was only very briefly a part of that team because I had some opinions that were kind of contrary to the way that we were rebranding the schools. But I would go into schools and my role was to look at their provision for children with special educational needs and disabilities. And these were schools that were in special measures and had been in special measures multiple times over. And you have to be going pretty spectacularly wrong to get special measures multiple times over. And it's no surprise that these schools weren't providing well for their children with special educational needs and disabilities within them. And I remember one particular school is a standout memory. I went and it was well known in the area as a rough school. Like the taxi driver went, "Oh my God, you're not going there, are you? Are you sure? Do you want to take somebody with you? Like, will you be safe?" They told me not to cross the playground on my own. "We'll come and get you. Phone us from the gates and we'll walk you across." Like, what are these children going to do to me as I walk across the playground? And then when I got in, all sorts of grim stuff was happening. But because it had such a bad reputation, nobody wanted to be a teacher there. All the teachers had quit. So the only people working there were newly qualified teachers who hadn't been able to get a job somewhere else. So it's like they'd got the duff ones from the latest batch of teachers. The duff ones were working there, the ones that hadn't been able to get a job somewhere else, and they didn't survive. So they lasted 3 months, 5 months, 6 months. Nobody had been there for longer than 6 months, apart from one member of staff who had been there for 11 years. And so all these junior teachers deferred to Bob, because Bob has been doing this for 11 years. And it made it a very easy job for me as an inspector, because my role was to figure out where this was going wrong. And you're like, I reckon it's probably something to do with Bob. Bob's the only one who's the consistent factor. And so I spent time hanging around with Bob, and my strategy would be to just like be quiet and seem nice. Because if you're quiet and seem nice, then people talk to you. And I could usually, well, not always, but sometimes if you did that, you could figure out what was going on in a school. Like I remember doing it in one school, and I was being quiet and being nice, and schools in special measures are not good at looking after their visitors. So they just kind of left me, and I was roaming the corridors looking for a cup of tea, and I found a lady sitting on the floor in a cupboard, sorting out the cupboard, and I was quiet and nice to her. And she told me that the head teacher had slept with the science teacher's wife, and that had led to the science department falling out with the maths department. Like, suddenly all the politics of this school made sense. So I spent time with Bob, and he said, "I wouldn't do a job like this in a school like this if I didn't care for the children. You have to care to work with kids like these." So the problem is, every so often, you just get a bad seed. And when you get a bad seed, really the fairest thing for the rest of the children would just be to have them removed, because they cause problems for the children around them. They disrupt the learning of others. These singular bad children, these bad seeds, these evil ones, these are the problem. And it's a problem for everybody. Problem for all the other children, all the other families. It's not fair. They should be removed. He told a really extreme version of that story. Like, I stood next to him with my clipboard and notepaper thinking, seriously, mate, you're telling me that some children are just born evil? What do you propose the solution is? We pop up to the hospital with a pillow and figure out which ones they are? Like, but actually, you hear versions of that story quite often. Like, this child doesn't belong here. It would be better if this child went somewhere else. It would be fairest for everybody else if this child wasn't here. What we're kind of saying in those stories is that this child is the problem. There's something wrong with this child. And alongside that story, there's one that you get. This is a really common one as well. It was so funny because I'm autistic, and I heard this one recently when I was standing at the side of a football pitch on a Sunday morning watching my son play football badly. And a parent from the other team was somebody I used to go to school with. And she recognised me and she came across, she went, "Hey, Joe, what are you doing here?" I had no idea who she was. Took me a while in the conversation to cotton on to who she was. And she was talking about her work, I was talking about my work. I told her that I'm autistic. So I sort of made a joke of like, you know, that explains some of why I was weird at school, and she laughed at the joke. And then after a while of sort of standing there and watching the game, she looked across at me, she went, I don't know what your take is on this, but do you not think there's more of them about now? Like, there didn't used to be so many of them when we were at school, did there? I mean, where were they all when we were at school? I was literally standing in front of her. I was like, I was it. Hello, I was there when we were at school. But this story about that there's more of them, there's more of them, there's more of them. It's true that there are more of us identified, where we are better at understanding what special educational needs and disabilities look like. You in the early years are key for spotting, for early identification of children who've got additional learning needs, neurodivergent conditions, you know, something going on for them. So you are getting better at spotting them. So you do spot more of them. We are culturally more aware of what this means. So we do spot more of them. Our diagnostic tools, so I'm autistic. The reason that I wasn't identified in childhood is because the diagnostic tools looked at how to identify autistic boys. Autistic women get identified about now. It's only like in the last 10 years that autistic women have been being spotted. It's not that there's more of us about, it's that we understand more how to spot us. And there's some really interesting parallels. So on my slide, this is my beautifully hand-drawn graph of the amount of left-handedness in society. So there used to be a time before we made everybody right, when like we weren't particularly aware of whether there was left-handedness or not. So there's no left-handed people. When you start hitting people at school for being left-handed, there's actually a little dip, and there's less left-handed people around at that time. So it's not, you don't have to go back far in education to be, for being writing with your left hand to be a canable offence. So at the time at which you would get hit for being left-handed, not very many left-handed people around. Then you just get a few left-handed people. People are getting slightly less willing to hit children. You get a few left-handed people. Those left-handed people get away with being left-handed, you know, and there's a few more left-handed. Suddenly, left-handed people bloody everywhere. There's millions of them. And then it plateaus, because it's like there is an amount of left-handedness within society, and we identified all of it and it plateaued. There's another graph that you can look at for the amount of homosexuality within society. It looks something like this. There didn't used to be any about, because we didn't used to think about it. Then you were not allowed to be it. So there's actually a little dip in this one too. And then you get a few people, really kind of overtly homosexual people. And then you get a few more people. Suddenly they're bloody everywhere. And then it plateaus. And you can see where I'm heading, can't you? Things like neurodivergence and understanding different processing, understanding different sensory capacities. Yeah, there's more of us about. But it doesn't mean that there's some sort of outbreak. They haven't put something in the water. We're just getting better at spotting it. There is a demographic within those groups for whom that bad seed narrative is especially dangerous. And those are people who have not been identified accurately. You know, if you know that the reason somebody is struggling with eating their snack is because they're autistic and they struggle with their sensory world, and a snack would be a really big sensory ask, then you make accommodations for them. If you think that they're just being naughty, they're just being bad, they're just making a fuss, they're just, you know, misbehaving, those accommodations don't get made and the stories build up around them. And people with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder are super at risk of these stories, and it's really interesting. So you probably all have children who are autistic identified in your setting, or have supported children who are autistic within your setting. The rates of autism, now my stats are, when did I read this? Probably about 5 years ago, might be 10 years ago, because my 5 years ago time is slipping faster. I read this a chunk of time ago, and when I looked at the stats then, autism was 1 in every 100 live births. So for every 100 babies, you'd expect 1 to be autistic. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder was 5. in every 100 live births. And I don't know what today's stats are, but I imagine the ratios are similar. So for every 1 autistic child you support, you would expect to support 5 with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. But very few counties in the UK have diagnostic pathways for identifying those children. So you would not expect to see them labelled as having fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And I know this work because sometimes in the introduction I say the youngest person I've worked with was a day old and the oldest person I've worked with was 87. That youngest person, that day old person, the reason that I was there to work with them at a day old was because we knew that they were going to be born to highly addicted parents and taken into care immediately, and that there would be various consequences to this. And so I was part of a group of people who were trying to give this child the best start in life. And I knew that that child was going to be born for pretty much the whole of that pregnancy. So from the point at which social services identified that the woman was pregnant and would not be allowed to keep the baby, I was involved in that child's life. And I knew, like, it's pretty guaranteed with this child, that they would be born with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder just through the number of substances the woman had consumed. And so I read up into it. And I read every piece of research that I could find into fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. It creates a neurodivergence in the brain that's similar to ADHD and autism in the way that it affects executive functioning, it affects impulse control, it affects your sensory processing. There's some little weird ones. There was one where it affects the part of your brain that deals with number. And so you would particularly, not all children with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder would have this. Some people think that fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is represented through face shape. So 10% of children with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder get a change in their faces that you can spot, but very much the minority. Read all of this research, and then I read the long-term outcomes and what causes the most harm to these children. What these children die of is not the differences in their brain, because once you identify that somebody's processing the world in a sensorially different way, you can accommodate that. Once you identify that they're not learning their maths great, you can accommodate that. All of those things were mitigatable. You could make adaptations that change. The thing that kills these children is the stories. When they're little, they don't settle to sleep well. They're difficult babies. When they go to nursery, they don't sit on the carpet nicely. They're naughty toddlers. They have tantrums in supermarkets. And their mum warns you. She says he was always a difficult baby, not like his siblings. You know, he's difficult. He's naughty. By the time the difficult baby, the naughty toddler, goes to school, it's well known that he's going to be a problem. And so it's expected. And these stories accumulate through life. And just to flag up, you're not looking for drunk parents. The child that I supported, it was very obvious. You can get fetal alcohol spectrum disorder from one exposure to alcohol in the womb. So it can be the glass of wine that the woman had before she knew she was pregnant. It doesn't have to be. The reason that the rates are on the rise is because of changes in our drinking habits. We're more likely to be having a glass of wine after work every day. And there is some work that shows that it can be carried in the sperm. So it could be that your dad was hammered when your mum got pregnant, you know. So it's a really dangerous one. Those stories, like, I reckon it's probably something to do with Bob. Bob's the only one who's the consistent factor. And so I spent time hanging around with Bob, and my strategy would be to just like be quiet and seem nice. Because if you're quiet and seem nice, then people talk to you. And I could usually, well, not always, but sometimes if you did that, you could figure out what was going on in a school. Like I remember doing it in one school, and I was being quiet and being nice, and schools and special measures are not good at looking after their visitors. So they just kind of left me, and I was roaming the corridors looking for a cup of tea, and I found a lady sitting on the floor in a cupboard, sorting out the cupboard, and I was quiet and nice to her. And she told me that the head teacher had slept with the science teacher's wife, and that had led to the science department falling out with the maths department. Like, suddenly all the politics of this school made sense. So I spent time with Bob, and he said, I wouldn't do a job like this in a school like this if I didn't care for the children. You have to care to work with kids like these. So the problem is, every so often, you just get a bad seed. And when you get a bad seed, really the fairest thing for the rest of the children would just be to have them removed, because they cause problems for the children around them. They disrupt the learning of others. These singular bad children, these bad seeds, these evil ones, these are the problem. And it's a problem for everybody. Problem for all the other children, all the other families. It's not fair. They should be removed. He told a really extreme version of that story. Like, I stood next to him with my clipboard and notepaper thinking, seriously, mate, you're telling me that some children are just born evil? What do you propose the solution is? We pop up to the hospital with a pillow and figure out which ones they are? Like, but actually, you hear versions of that story quite often. Like, this child doesn't belong here. It would be better if this child went somewhere else. It would be fairest for everybody else if this child wasn't here. What we're kind of saying in those stories is that this child is the problem. There's something wrong with this child. And alongside that story, there's one that you get. This is a really common one as well. And it was so funny because I'm autistic, and I heard this one recently when I was standing at the side of a football pitch on a Sunday morning watching my son play football badly. And a parent from the other team was somebody I used to go to school with. And she recognised me and she came across, she went, "Hey, Joe, what are you doing here?" I had no idea who she was. Took me a while in the conversation to cotton on to who she was. And she was talking about her work. I was talking about my work. I told her that I'm autistic. And so I sort of made a joke of like, you know, that explains some of why I was weird at school, and she laughed at the joke. And then after a while of sort of standing there and watching the game, she looked across at me, she went, I don't know what your take is on this, but do you not think there's more of them about now? Like, there didn't used to be so many of them when we were at school, did there? I mean, where were they all when we were at school? I was literally standing in front of her. I was like, I was it. Hello, I was there when we were at school. But this story about that there's more of them, there's more of them, there's more of them. It's true that there are more of us identified, where we are better at understanding what special educational needs and disabilities look like. You in the early years are key for spotting, for early identification of children who've got additional learning needs, neurodivergent conditions, you know, something going on for them. So you are getting better at spotting them. So you do spot more of them. We are culturally more aware of what this means. So we do spot more of them. Our diagnostic tools, so I'm autistic. The reason that I wasn't identified in childhood is because the diagnostic tools looked at how to identify autistic boys. Autistic women get identified about now. It's only like in the last 10 years that autistic women have been being spotted. It's not that there's more of us about, it's that we understand more how to spot us. And there's some really interesting parallels. So on my slide, this is my beautifully hand-drawn graph of the amount of left-handedness in society. So there used to be a time before we made everybody right, when like we weren't particularly aware of whether there was left-handedness or not. So there's no left-handed people. When you start hitting people at school for being left-handed, there's actually a little dip, and there's less left-handed people around at that time. So it's not, you don't have to go back far in education to be for being writing with your left hand to be a canable offence. So at the time at which you would get hit for being left-handed, not very many left-handed people around. Then you just get a few left-handed people. People are getting slightly less willing to hit children. You get a few left-handed people. Those left-handed people get away with being left-handed, you know, and there's a few more left-handed. Suddenly, left-handed people bloody everywhere. There's millions of them. And then it plateaus, because it's like there is an amount of left-handedness within society, and we identified all of it and it plateaued. There's another graph that you can look at for the amount of homosexuality within society. It looks something like this. There didn't used to be any about, because we didn't used to think about it. Then you were not allowed to be it. So there's actually a little dip in this one too. And then you get a few people, really kind of overtly homosexual people. And then you get a few more people. Suddenly they're bloody everywhere. And then it plateaus. And you can see where I'm heading, can't you? Things like neurodivergence and understanding different processing, understanding different sensory capacities. Yeah, there's more of us about, but it doesn't mean that there's some sort of outbreak. They haven't put something in the water. We're just getting better at spotting it. There is a demographic within those groups for whom that bad seed narrative is especially dangerous. And those are people who have not been identified accurately. You know, if you know that the reason somebody is struggling with eating their snack is because they're autistic and they struggle with their sensory world, and a snack would be a really big sensory ask, then you make accommodations for them. If you think that they're just being naughty, they're just being bad, they're just making a fuss, they're just, you know, misbehaving, those accommodations don't get made and the stories build up around them. And people with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder are super at risk of these stories. And it's really interesting. So you probably all have children who are autistic identified in your setting, or have supported children who are autistic within your setting. The rates of autism, now my stats are, when did I read this? Probably about 5 years ago, might be 10 years ago, because my 5 years ago time is slipping faster. I read this a chunk of time ago, and when I looked at the stats then, autism was 1 in every 100 live births. So for every 100 babies, you'd expect 1 to be autistic. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder was 5 in every 100 live births. And I don't know what today's stats are, but I imagine the ratios are similar. So for every 1 autistic child you support, you would expect to support 5 with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. But very few counties in the UK have diagnostic pathways for identifying those children. So you would not expect to see them labelled as having fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And I know this work because sometimes in the introduction I say the youngest person I've worked with was a day old, and the oldest person I've worked with was 87. That youngest person, that day old person, the reason that I was there to work with them at a day old was because we knew that they were going to be born to highly addicted parents and taken into care immediately, and that there would be various consequences to this. And so I was part of a group of people who were trying to give this child the best start in life. And I knew that that child was going to be born for pretty much the whole of that pregnancy. So from the point at which social services identified that the woman was pregnant and would not be allowed to keep the baby, I was involved in that child's life. And I knew, like, it's pretty guaranteed with this child, that they would be born with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder just through the number of substances the woman had consumed. And so I read up into it. And I read every piece of research that I could find into fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. It creates a neurodivergence in the brain that's similar to ADHD and autism in the way that it affects executive functioning, it affects impulse control, it affects sensory processing. There's some little weird ones. There was one where it affects the part of your brain that deals with number. And so you would particularly, not all children with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder would have this. Some people think that fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is represented through face shape. So 10% of children with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder get a change in their faces that you can spot, but very much the minority. Read all of this research, and then I read the long-term outcomes and what causes the most harm to these children. What these children die of is not the differences in their brain, because once you identify that somebody's processing the world in a sensorially different way, you can accommodate that. Once you identify that they're not learning their maths great, you can accommodate that. All of those things were mitigatable. You could make adaptations that change. The thing that kills these children is the stories. When they're little, they don't settle to sleep well. They're difficult babies. When they go to nursery, they don't sit on the carpet nicely. They're naughty toddlers. They have tantrums in supermarkets. And their mum warns you. She says he was always a difficult baby, not like his siblings. You know, he's difficult. He's naughty. By the time the difficult baby, the naughty toddler, goes to school, It's well known that he's going to be a problem. And so it's expected. And these stories accumulate through life. And just to flag up, you're not looking for drunk parents. The child that I supported, it was very obvious. You can get fetal alcohol spectrum disorder from one exposure to alcohol in the womb. So it can be the glass of wine that the woman had before she knew she was pregnant. It's not, it doesn't have to be. The reason that the rates are on the rise is because of changes in our drinking habits. We're more likely to be having a glass of wine after work every day. And there is some work that shows that it can be carried in the sperm. So it could be that your dad was hammered when your mum got pregnant. 6 months, nobody had been there for longer than 6 months, apart from one member of staff who had been there for 11 years. And so all these junior teachers deferred to Bob, because Bob has been doing this for 11 years. And it made it a very easy job for me as an inspector, because my role was to figure out where this was going wrong. And you're like, I reckon it's probably something to do with Bob. Bob's the only one who's the consistent factor. And so I spent time hanging around with Bob, and my strategy would be to just like be quiet and seem nice. Because if you're quiet and seem nice, then people talk to you. And I could usually, well, not always, but sometimes if you did that, you could figure out what was going on in a school. Like I remember doing it in one school, and I was being quiet and being nice, and schools and special measures are not good at looking after their visitors. So they just kind of left me, and I was roaming the corridors looking for a cup of tea, and I found a lady sitting on the floor in a cupboard, sorting out the cupboard, and I was quiet and nice to her. And she told me that the head teacher had slept with the science teacher's wife, and that had led to the science department falling out with the maths department. You're like, suddenly all the politics of this school made sense. So I spent time with Bob, and he said, I wouldn't do a job like this in a school like this if I didn't care for the children. You have to care to work with kids like these. He said, the problem is, every so often, you just get a bad seed. And when you get a bad seed, really the fairest thing for the rest of the children would just be to have them removed, because they cause problems for the children around them. They disrupt the learning of others. These singular bad children, these bad seeds, these evil ones, these are the problem. And it's a problem for everybody. Problem for all the other children, all the other families. It's not fair. They should be removed. He told a really extreme version of that story. Like I stood next to him with my clipboard and notepaper thinking, seriously, mate, you're telling me that some children are just born evil? What do you propose the solution is? We pop up to the hospital with a pillow and figure out which ones they are? Like, but actually, you hear versions of that story quite often. Like, this child doesn't belong here. It would be better if this child went somewhere else. It would be fairest for everybody else if this child wasn't here. What we're kind of saying in those stories is that this child is the problem. There's something wrong with this child. And alongside that story, there's one that you get. This is a really common one as well. And it was so funny because I'm autistic, and I heard this one recently when I was standing at the side of a football pitch on a Sunday morning watching my son play football badly. And a parent from the other team was somebody I used to go to school with. And she recognised me and she came across, she went, "Hey, Joe, what are you doing here?" I had no idea who she was. Took me a while in the conversation to cotton on to who she was. And she was talking about her work. I was talking about my work. I told her that I'm autistic. And so I sort of made a joke of like, you know, that explains some of why I was weird at school, and she laughed at the joke. And then after a while of sort of standing there and watching the game, she looked across at me, she went, I don't know what your take is on this, but do you not think there's more of them about now? Like, there didn't used to be so many of them when we were at school, did there? I mean, where were they all when we were at school? I was literally standing in front of her. I was like, I was it. Hello, I was there when we were at school. But this story about that there's more of them, there's more of them, there's more of them. It's true that there are more of us identified, where we are better at understanding what special educational needs and disabilities look like. You in the early years are key for spotting, for early identification, of children who've got additional learning needs, neurodivergent conditions, something going on for them. So you are getting better at spotting them. So you do spot more of them. We are culturally more aware of what this means. So we do spot more of them. Our diagnostic tools, so I'm autistic. The reason that I wasn't identified in childhood is because the diagnostic tools looked at how to identify autistic boys. Autistic women get identified about now. It's only like in the last 10 years that autistic women have been being spotted. It's not that there's more of us about, it's that we understand more how to spot us. And there's some really interesting parallels. So on my slide, this is my beautifully hand-drawn graph of the amount of left-handedness in society. So there used to be a time before we made everybody right, when we weren't particularly aware of whether there was left-handedness or not. So there's no left-handed people. When you start hitting people at school for being left-handed, there's actually a little dip, and there's less left-handed people around at that time. So it's not, you don't have to go back far in education to be, for writing with your left hand to be a canable offence. So at the time at which you would get hit for being left-handed, not very many left-handed people around. Then you just get a few left-handed people. People are getting slightly less willing to hit children. You get a few left-handed people. Those left-handed people get away with being left-handed, and there's a few more left-handed. Suddenly, left-handed people bloody everywhere. There's millions of them. And then it plateaus, because it's like there is an amount of left-handedness within society, and we identified all of it and it plateaued. There's another graph that you can look at for the amount of homosexuality within society. It looks something like this. There didn't used to be any about, because we didn't used to think about it. Then you were not allowed to be it. So there's actually a little dip in this one too. And then you get a few people, really kind of overtly homosexual people. And then you get a few more people. Suddenly they're bloody everywhere. And then it plateaus. And you can see where I'm heading, can't you? Things like neurodivergence and understanding different processing, understanding different sensory capacities. Yeah, there's more of us about. But it doesn't mean that there's some sort of outbreak. They haven't put something in the water. We're just getting better at spotting it. There is a demographic within those groups for whom that bad seed narrative is especially dangerous. And those are people who have not been identified accurately. If you know that the reason somebody is struggling with eating their snack is because they're autistic and they struggle with their sensory world, and a snack would be a really big sensory ask, then you make accommodations for them. If you think that they're just being naughty, they're just being bad, they're just making a fuss, they're just, misbehaving, those accommodations don't get made and the stories build up around them. And people with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder are super at risk of these stories, and it's really interesting. So you probably all have children who are autistic identified in your setting, or have supported children who are autistic within your setting. The rates of autism, now my stats are, when did I read this? Probably about 5 years ago, might be 10 years ago, because my 5 years ago time is slipping faster. I read this a chunk of time ago, and when I looked at the stats then, autism was 1 in every 100 live births. So for every 100 babies, you'd expect 1 to be autistic. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder was 5 in every 100 live births. And I don't know what today's stats are, but I imagine the ratios are similar. So for every 1 autistic child you support, you would expect to support 5 with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. But very few counties in the UK have diagnostic pathways for identifying those children. So you would not expect to see them labelled as having fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And I know this work because sometimes in the introduction I say, the youngest person I've worked with was a day old, and the oldest person I've worked with was 87. That youngest person, that day old person, the reason that I was there to work with them at a day old was because we knew that they were going to be born to highly addicted parents and taken into care immediately, and that there would be various consequences to this. And so I was part of a group of people who were trying to give this child the best start in life. And I knew that that child was going to be born for pretty much the whole of that pregnancy. So from the point at which social services identified that the woman was pregnant and would not be allowed to keep the baby, I was involved in that child's life. And I knew, like, it's pretty guaranteed with this child, that they would be born with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder just through the number of substances the woman had consumed. And so I read up into it. And I read every piece of research that I could find into fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. It creates a neurodivergence in the brain that's similar to ADHD and autism in the way that it affects executive functioning, it affects impulse control, it affects your sensory processing. There's some little weird ones. There was one where it affects the part of your brain that deals with number. And so you would particularly, not all children with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder would have this. Some people think that fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is represented through face shape. So 10% of children with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder get a change in their faces that you can spot, but very much the minority. Read all of this research, and then I read the long-term outcomes and what causes the most harm to these children. What these children die of is not the differences in their brain, because once you identify that somebody's processing the world in a sensorially different way, you can accommodate that. Once you identify that they're not learning their maths great, you can accommodate that. All of those things were mitigatable. You could make adaptations that change. The thing that kills these children is the stories. When they're little, they don't settle to sleep well. They're difficult babies. When they go to nursery, they don't sit on the carpet nicely. They're naughty toddlers. They have tantrums in supermarkets. And their mum warns you. She says he was always a difficult baby, not like his siblings. You know, he's difficult. He's naughty. By the time the difficult baby, the naughty toddler, goes to school, it's well known that he's going to be a problem. And so it's expected. And these stories accumulate through life. And just to flag up, you're not looking for drunk parents. The child that I supported, it was very obvious. You can get fetal alcohol spectrum disorder from one bar judging us. And so it feels safer if we go, don't worry, I know what to do. We'll just put the star chart up and we'll make sure he sits on the step and he knows that he's been wrong. And like that kind of grip for certainty is an expression of our vulnerability. And if you are a manager of a setting, and you can create spaces in which staff feel safe to say, I don't know what to do. I don't know what's going on with this child. I remember when I was a young teacher, I would meet the parents at parents' evening, and I really wanted to prove to them that I understood what I was doing. And so I was very confident in how I told them about their child. I didn't ever tell them, I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm barely managing, because that's not professional, is it? But it would have been much nicer for those parents if I'd gone, tell me about your child. I want to learn as much about your child from you as I can, because you're clearly going to be the experts in this child. You're going to be able to tell me how this child is feeling. You're going to be able to tell me what this child does when they're happy, what this child does when they're sad. What do your instincts tell you? Because parents' instincts are usually right, and those instincts are usually silenced by professionals around them. And if you ask them for their instincts, then you protect them. The people, I know I'm over time, I'm going to stop talking, I promise. But the biggest risk with those instincts is the medical community. The medical community, for various structural reasons, override the instincts of mothers in particular. So a mum will have a gut instinct that there's something wrong with her baby, take it to the doctors, and the doctors will go, oh, don't worry, babies make a fuss, go away. Those instincts will be right. If you are asking them, what are your instincts? Then you're validating to them that their instincts count, and you make that voice louder in other situations too. It's I need my railway tracks back. These things that you do now at the start of these lives have such a consequence lifelong and can be life lengthening. So I'm zipping it now because I was supposed to start questions about 5 minutes ago.
That's all right.
Sorry. Have we got some in the chat? If you want to unmic and ask me questions, I think you're allowed. Or I don't know if Gail's got you muted.
Yeah, of course, people can just ask questions in the chat. Joanna, that was amazing. I think, including myself, I was on the edge of my seat the whole time, literally hanging at every word you were saying. So thank you so much. It's so refreshing to hear you speak, because it really is from the heart and it's from personal experiences as well. So I think that really helps. We have got a couple of questions. We've got one where someone has asked, what advice do you have if you have parents who may unknowingly reinforce limiting labels?
It's a really interesting one. And so I meet it, and my instinct is I want to just sort of tell them that they're wrong and that they don't understand. But people very rarely hear that when you say things directly to them. And I can think of examples that I've encountered where so like a child would be diagnosed as being autistic, and the parents will have been signposted to particular sources of information about autism that might be quite pathologizing and have very limited expectations. And there's a lot of that about. You can go to, you know, big autism charities, and a lot of them are still drawing on the sort of research that was layered up on that slide earlier. So what you need is representation, other forms of information, like examples. You want to provide them with the opportunity for them to learn it rather than be told it directly. So I would always have a set of websites that I'd signpost to. So things like the Yellow Ladybugs Project in Australia is a organisation that looks at the experiences of autistic girls. So that's often a website that I'm signposting to, and they're really lovely and positive. So I'd be looking for, oh, so your child's got whatever it is, and that's really terrible. Is it okay? Have you read this? You know, have you seen this? So have YouTube clips, TikTok clips, wherever they're most likely to take that information from, rather than try and tackle it head on. You kind of provide the resources that they need to change their view, and that's a gentler way of doing it, but it's really difficult. Yes, Yellow Ladybugs is brilliant. Can you share some immediate steps we can take to reframe negative narratives in our nurseries? If you are a staff member and you're hearing other staff members, sometimes if you can catch it as it's happening and just reframe it, you like, if somebody's saying, oh, you know, Benji's being a right little so-and-so today, you can go, oh yes, I'd noticed that Benji is feeling particularly vulnerable today. You know, and if you can get in quick and just provide the other version, and actually, honestly, if you kind of agree between you to do this collaboratively, because it's very easy. I will say these things about my children, like, oh, I just need him to just shut up. The small one just makes noise. He wakes up, he makes noise from when he wakes up to when he falls asleep, any form of noise. And it's very difficult to go, oh, he needs to be heard, because you're like, just shut up, just shut up. But if you've got colleagues who you're friendly with and you want to create these changes, then agreeing between you, should we just keep an eye on each other's narratives and see if we can do this adjust? And my end slide, like that is, if your narrative starts with that, if your narrative doesn't match with that, then you're getting it wrong, because children are not born evil, and parents almost universally try their best. Even in cases of serious neglect, it's rarely that the parents didn't try. It's often that they just hadn't got the skills themselves. So parents are generally behind their children, willing their children on, doing their best by their children. It might not look like that from the outside, but that's normally what's happening. So if you can start from that, and if your story doesn't match with that, then you need to adjust your story so it does. Or I'd go with adjusting your story so it does. How can you help a parent who is still grieving for the child they wanted? I used to ask that question so much. It's a really noticeable thing. So I used to teach in a special school, and the children in my class were 6 to 8 years old. And some parents go through that switch between the child they expected having and the child that they got pretty quickly. And some parents take longer, and the difference in that switch is huge. And you always have a right to grieve the child that you expected to have, but that child didn't exist. I know parents who that child did exist, and the child is disabled as a consequence of injury, or as a consequence of abuse, or as a consequence of serious illness. But adjusting to the child that you have I think there isn't a quick switch. People grieve at different speeds, and you could always have that grief going on. But I think a way to help them. Oh, I remember being in a parents' evening with a family. They had a daughter. She was autistic, and they had been planning to have a big family, but when they had an autistic child, they stopped that plan because they were frightened that they wouldn't be able to provide for her. They provided for her in every way they possibly could. They changed the model of the downstairs layout of their house to accommodate her needs. They gave her every opportunity, but they really, really struggled. And she was 7 and in my class, and I had parents' evening, and the dad was off work, long-term sick with depression, and he was depressed because he just couldn't fathom what his daughter's life was going to be like. And I was a young, naive teacher at that time, and I just happened to say in the meeting that I thought she'd make a great vet because she was so interested in animals. And I remember him picking his head up and going, "Do you think she could have a job one day?" And then I realized how much more of this story I have than he had. All he had was, my daughter has this thing and this thing is terrible. And he didn't have any of the rest of the story. Whereas I have, autistic people can do this, and autistic people have done this, and autistic brains are really great at doing this. And so by giving him that other story, by telling him who his daughter was now, like I see her now, and she is great with animals. She's really interested in animals. And it's odd because you would think that the parent does see their child now, but sometimes when that grief is so big, all they see is kind of the shadow of the child they thought they would have. So narrating to them, telling them the story of who their child is now can help to tip that balance, and providing them with stories about people who are like their children in the future. It's all stories, isn't it? It's the importance of representation in literature and culture. If you've met stories about people like you, you are more able to achieve. Barack Obama's presidency affected the speaking and listening skills of young African-American children in the States because they saw somebody like me speaking. It's that simple. So providing the other stories. I'm talking too long and the questions come. Oh no, it's people saying thank you. I panicked then. I thought it was questions. There's one I missed further up. Adele, do you know what it was?
I've got it here.
You actually answered it.
Oh, did I?
Because it was a similar question. One was about actually with staff in the setting. And you actually answered, so it's very similar. But yes, Joanna, I know there's a lot of people having to go back to the rooms, and obviously, as you know, ratios is very important to get back. I just quickly wanted to say thank you so much for your time.